warm welcome to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Bled in very difficult circumstances, and I'm not just talking about the weather, but also what the country has been through over the past few weeks. And it's a great honor to be here, and I guess that all the victims of the floods and all those who've been impacted by the floods are on everyone's minds. My name is Gregoire Roos, and I'm the head of Political Dialogue and Innovation at the BMW Foundation. It is our great pleasure as an organization committed to advancing responsible leadership to have been a partner to the Bled Strategic Forum for many years now. And I must say that this session is a bit peculiar, and I turn to Martin Frick here, that I will introduce in a short moment, because we were actually sitting in that same room exactly 1 year ago, talking about almost the same topic, food security, or I think it was insecurity back then already. Now, a year later, 18 months into the war in Ukraine, we have seen in parallel the acceleration of economic shocks and the acceleration of the impact of climate change on the most vulnerable communities, and not just in Europe, across the global south. The question I'd like to ask ourselves is it doomed, and are we doomed to come back here next year in the exact same room and just lament about the state of the world and the fact that we cannot improve anything? And the answer is obviously no, and I will count on that wonderful panel to come up with some positive prospect and positive food for thought. I have one bad news. We were very privileged to have with us, and I guess that there's a Brazilian delegation, Mrs. Da Rocha, who is the Secretary General of the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There's been an issue with her aircraft. So fortunately, she's not flying from Russia, but from Brazil. So she will be with us, but later today, not on time, unfortunately, to join that panel. But we are very privileged to be joined by a very diverse set of people. And I will start with Martin Frick, who no longer needs any introduction here in Bled, but he's currently the director of the Berlin office of the World Food Programme, who has held many different positions at the top level of German diplomacy in the UN, of the UNFCCC. And I can say, Martin, now that we've known for a few years, that you are not just a climate champion, but a food champion and a security champion. I think it's the nexus that we will talk about, I guess, within the next 75 minutes. With us also Ambassador Deike Potzel, who is currently Director General for Crisis Prevention, Peace Building, and humanitarian assistance at the German Federal Foreign Office. And before that, Ambassador Potzel served as Ambassador of Germany to Ireland at a very sensitive time, should we say, for both Ireland, the UK, and Europe. We're also joined live, so I can see you, Herr Golubiewski, but I don't know whether, we can see you, wonderful. So connecting from Brussels, the head of cabinet of the EU Commissioner for Agriculture. We're very grateful that you find the time to be with us. There will be obviously many questions given the recent developments in Ukraine. And we're really happy to have you with us. And last but not least, Maryna Domushkina from, you've had many hats actually, yeah? You've been a political advisor to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and you're now a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. I will ask you lots of very naughty questions about the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and I hope that you can answer most of them. So we'd like to keep that discussion as interactive as possible, and I obviously welcome the audience who is following us online. We will engage in a first set of introductory remarks, and then a panel discussion, and I guess that some microphones will circulate in the audience and just catch my eye, and we will then have an exchange with you, and we look forward to being challenged by your question. So I don't think
Gregoire, if I may just say one thing, I see everyone upside down. It makes
I think that's not that's on purpose. I think it reflects the state of the world.
To interact with you, but if somebody could turn the camera.
Well, there's a panel on Europe on the other side. I wonder whether it's the same. But can we do something about it, or shall we say upside down?
Well,
right. I hope that this can be addressed. I will obviously. I think this was a great introduction, by the way, because I was about to make a kind of a background assessment of where we stand, and not just with Ukraine, but also obviously across the most vulnerable communities and countries around the world. And if we look at the figures, which I will not try to do too extensively, it's all very depressing. We've seen that the number of people on the verge of hunger is reaching a high peak, more than 300 million people. You have all heard that the Russian president has decided to unilaterally leave the Black Sea Grain Initiative, at least for now, which is putting at risk some more 100 million lives and livelihoods across 45 countries. So the issue is that it's actually not just a European question, but it's a question for many countries, especially in Africa. And actually we have felt here in the OECD economies the impact on our daily life of rising inflation, commodity prices and food prices. So everyone is more or less on the same boat. Though, of course, not with the same view. And of course, we've seen here rain bonds, not just in Slovenia, but throughout Europe. I mean, most of the people who spend their summer in Northern Europe thought that this was a winter Europe because there was rain absolutely everywhere. And the question is whether this is meant to remain as a long-term trend, and I guess that it will, and we will need to deal with it, but also with the implications for food supply chains and for the entire agriculture industry. So I'd like to start with, because Mrs. Darosha cannot join us, with you, Ambassador Potzel. You've been working across many different areas in not just actually peace building and working, we had that discussion earlier, working on preparation of that discussion. I was very, not intrigued, but positively surprised by the title of your portfolio. It's not just usually you have humanitarian affairs and peace building. No, it starts with crisis prevention, then stabilization, then peace building, and then humanitarian assistance. So it says a lot about the kind of holistic approach that Germany is currently or trying to have when it comes to I guess, integrate the nexus food security, climate, poverty in its development policy.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks very much for the invitation and for that question. Let me also start by extending my condolences to Slovenia for the catastrophe that hit you, and I would also like to thank you, our Slovenian partners, for the extremely warm welcome and support that they extended to the engineers that came over from Germany to support you here. That given the crisis you were in is really amazing, so thank you very much for that. Now, coming to your question, if you look at actually the budget, we should turn around the title. So we last year spent 3.2 billion on humanitarian assistance and half a billion on stabilization crisis prevention. But then, of course, we also have the development cooperation money that adds up to that. But indeed, you're right that it says something about our approach. We have just recently published our national security strategy, the first ever. And that talks very much about an integrated understanding of security. We have also published our integrated peace engagement commitment strategy within the Foreign Ministry, which again talks about the combination of what you were saying, crisis prevention, stabilization, and peace building. So that is very close to our heart. We believe a lot in ownership, and if we have time later, I'm very happy to share more about the stabilization concept, which is really based on the issue of ownership, and which basically also says we need legitimate state actors on the ground. We need peace, because that is the basis for development, that is also the basis for food security, for the development of a sustainable, resilient agriculture, for rural development and agriculture development as such. So that also brings me to the HDP nexus, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, the combination and really the better interaction of humanitarian development and peace actors. I think we are doing a bit better on the H and the D, but I think the P really needs to be strengthened much more, and this is what we are also trying to portray in our title.
P for poverty.
No, P for peace, of course.
The Freudian slip, I guess. How many military officials do we have in the room? Can they raise their hand? If oh, come on, I see some of you in the back, don't be ashamed. Right, we have very shy military officials today in the room, but for the audience online, we have some. I just want to check whether we're still upside down in Brussels. We can't hear you, but I guess that you look happy, so it means we are back with on our foot. Great. I'd like to turn to Martin. We have seen, and again, this will not be a discussion just about Ukraine, but the implications have been such that we cannot avoid not to talk about it, that we have seen what has been going on in the Black Sea, and 50% of Ukrainian exports are still going through the Black Sea. And with what has been going on, and namely the fact that Russia has been attacking some ship, and not just Ukrainian ship, but also Turkish ship, this has meant a significant impact for those who are counting on that food, namely in the poorest country of sub-Saharan Africa, but also some resources, financial resources for the Ukrainian state. So the impact is tremendous, which means that the shipment of food has become a battleground in itself, and a war weapon. So the question, Martin, is that I remember again sitting here last year, and we were still pondering whether we would see a kind of stabilization, whether we would secure food as what it actually is under international law, human rights. And we remember that UN resolution from 2018, 2417 or 18, if I'm not mistaken, that reminds everyone that any breach of or any use of food as a weapon of war is a breach of international humanitarian law. We're still there. So the risk that we feel is that this could be replicated in other regions of the world, not necessarily at war, but with regional instability and conflict. So how has this impacted your work? And how has this heightened further the pressure on the most vulnerable population, who actually happen to be at the forefront of climate change? So it's a kind of multiple set of crises falling on them.
Yeah, thank you, Gregoire. And I think it's noteworthy also to recalling that we are having this year the half-time of the Sustainable Development Goals, and in 2015, which seems an eternity ago, the international community was so positive about the possibility to end hunger that it ended up in one of the most prominent Sustainable Development Goals, Zero Hunger by 2030, SDG 2. And now we see exactly the opposite. And what we have witnessed over the last years is really a toxic mix of different factors. COVID seems to be something from a decade ago, but the financial repercussions of COVID are still with us. And we are in a situation in which there is a debt crisis of some of the poorest countries of the world, in which there is inflation, even hyperinflation in these countries, and exchange rates compared to the dollars, which are getting more and more difficult for countries to buy food on the global market. And in this situation, all the interruption of the grain from Ukraine and the constant insecurity, even while the Black Sea Grain Agreement was working, has its repercussions in prices. So what we see is really a big question mark behind what was the food systems for, you could say, 2 decades, which basically means that many poor countries focused on producing cash crops for export and were increasingly dependent from cheap food from the international market for import. Now we know that often the prices that poor countries obtain for products such as cotton or coffee, cacao, banana, what have you, are competitive, to say the least. That often they are not getting the money they should be getting for producing those cash crops, while at the same time the prices for importing food are soaring. So we are seeing the vulnerability of the international systems, many uncertainties, and markets react always in the same way to uncertainties, which is raising the prices, raising the insurance premiums. In all this insecurity, there's only one thing certain, and it's a cynical thing to say, but the one thing we know for certain is that the impacts of climate change will become more severe every single year. Even if at the next COP in the United Arab Emirates, we would suddenly have an unbelievable breakthrough and we would stop global emissions in 2024, of course totally unrealistic, we would still see decades of increased warming. So in that situation, we need to really think in a systemic way. We cannot afford to think in silos. And we need to factor in the increasing food insecurity also when thinking about security policy. And there are things we can do, but maybe we talk about that later in the discussion.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Brussels and to you, Maciej. In a few days ago, there was a meeting of the trade ministers of the G20, and Commissioner Dombrovskis, I know you're not the head of his cabinet, but there are trade implications, obviously, called for the need to safeguard, I quote, solidarity corridors when it comes to the trade of agricultural products. I mean, this platform is about solidarity. In your view, is there still such a thing as solidarity when it comes to agriculture in a context of war?
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Apologies for not being in the beautiful Bled. Condolences to everybody in Slovenia that suffered from the floods, including poor farmers. Yes, indeed, I'm an agricultural head of cabinet of agriculture commissioner, but obviously we work very closely with Commissioner Dombrovskis, Vice President Dombrovskis on this. Solidarity lanes. We are working closely all the time with Ukraine and with all the member states concerned that form the fulcrum of the solidarity lanes to continually improve both the infrastructure of it, because this is a huge problem continuing with the closure of the Black Sea. We need to rely more on the Danube corridor. Romania is playing an absolutely amazing part in ensuring that the capacity there is constantly increased. So we're working on those so-called alternative routes. The problem is, and it's less of a question of solidarity, but it's a question of ensuring that it is economically viable, is that transporting grain through land routes, which are the alternative routes going, let's say, through the border states to the east of Ukraine, is extremely costly. We have a situation there basically where it's not given the fact that Ukraine lost sea markets, sea transport routes to the markets that they usually exported to. They put a lot of grain on road, and it's just extremely economically difficult to make a good return on those. So we need to ensure that the costs of shipments using land routes to ports are decreased. We have a platform with Ukraine, and EVP Dombrovskis, his head of cabinet, my colleague Michael Hager is chairing it. We're constantly trying to improve this. So solidarity is very much in full swing, even though we all are aware of, and it is a fact, that because of that initial crisis where grain that could not be shipped out by sea was shipped to nearby countries, it increased an absolutely horrific increase in supply in those border countries, that we have to deal with this acute local crisis that resulted in a kind of a temporary suspension of imports of grains from Ukraine. But that is an economic internal domestic problem, whereas we all agree that we need to find cheaper ways of getting grains out. So, through our transport monies, also possibly using cohesion in the future, we're trying to see how we can get those costs down. So I wouldn't worry so much about solidarity on the solidarity lanes part. We are working very closely on this with all concerned.
Thank you very much. I guess we will come back to that issue, especially as President Zelensky has announced that he was currently working along with global insurers and insurer brokers on a special mechanism that would enable a better coverage or insurance of food shipment, who would hug, if I may say so, the coast and get the food through Africa. I'd like to turn to you, Maryna, you have obviously been working a lot on the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So perhaps you would like to tell us more about its successes. So as most of you have heard, the Russia has broken, if I may say so, its commitment by unilaterally going out of the deal. But in less than a year, it has achieved significant success with, I guess, more than 30 million tons of food that it managed to secure in wartime through the Black Sea. I guess the strategic importance is that, as we were saying earlier, 50% of Ukrainian exports are still going through the Black Sea, with only 24% through the western border and 24% through the Danube coast, especially through Romania. So how likely is it that we can reduce that dependency on the Black Sea within the near future?
Thank you, Gregoire. I'd like to thank for the invitation, and it is an honor to be the panelists among such distinguished panelists, and as well I would like to express my condolences to Slovenian people who've just suffered a tremendous floods, and I'd like to also say that Ukraine stands with you, and I'm happy to say that despite of the war in Ukraine, our country was able to send rescuers to support Slovenian people. But this flood also shows us the tremendous effect of climate security and climate changes that are caused by our actions. And I also believe that with the Russian war on Ukraine, we are now in the understanding that we cannot look into security separately, into climate security, into food security, into human security, energy security. What showed us that it's all interdependent and one leads to another. It's like a domino. So going back to your question, first of all, you need to understand that before the full-scale invasion, Ukraine was exporting about 6 million metric tons through its ports. And it was probably the biggest export all over Europe that was not in comparison to any other ports. Ukraine was also exporting to 136 export markets in the world before the invasion, and was sharing 9% of global wheat, 11% of barley, 13% of maize, 55% of sunflower oil and meal. And I remember that beginning of June, there was lack of sunflower oil in the supermarkets in the European Union, and people couldn't understand that it came from Ukraine, that it's actually interconnected, that the amount of food that is available in the groceries is the consequences of Russian war on Ukraine. So the several actors started working into unblocking the ports back in April 2022. And back the time, I remember it was headlines everywhere, the mission impossible. Well, I don't believe in impossible. I think that let's find a way. That's my motto. The EU stood in and still continues to stand in solidarity with Ukraine, in support with the EU solidarity lanes, but even that was not enough. Because the logistics worked the way that, again, as I told you, the majority of the exports was going through the Black Sea. Once the Black Sea was basically blocked by the Russian military ships, the Ukrainian governments have started working into going through the railway through the trucks and roads, the Danube River, obviously, but even that was not enough. If you look back to the numbers, back in March, less than 1 million was exported. And by the time when the initiative started in August 2022 and through the whole period, together with EU Solidarity Lanes and Black Sea Grain Initiative and Danube River, the export managed to be 96% of pre-war numbers. And that's only because it is a united effort from different actors that helped to stabilize the prices. We all have seen the tremendous peak in prices back in March 2022. Once the initiative started, the FAO price index dropped 23% from the peak in March. And you need to understand how the prices worked. It works with the availability at the market. It's not where the food goes, you know, to what country. It's about whether the food is available, and that's very important. That's why the success of Black Sea Grain Initiative combined with other efforts was tremendously, again, important to the whole world. Going also a little bit to comment on what Martin was saying, that COVID-19 inflation is postponed and we start feeling it only now. And together with Russian war on Ukraine, this all had combined effects. Answering your question a little bit shorter than you wanted, there is no alternative if the ports are blocked. We will not be able to send amount of food that there is a demand in the world, and the prices will continue to rise. So even together with solidarity lanes, together with the Nube railway, it will not be enough. The ports need to be unblocked.
So as I told you earlier, I was looking for some bright prospect, but not there yet. As we were just like we'll go to the topic of land restoration and the impact of climate, of course. But following up on that, I was referring to the initiative of President Zelensky to create a new mechanism bringing in international insurers and brokers. I'd like to turn to you, Martin, and perhaps you, Maciej, in Brussels. Is this something that the EU and the World Food Programme could support at some point and replicate anywhere that we have that kind of regional conflict, that we have an insurance mechanism? Who goes first? Maciej, it's you, I guess.
Well, yes, there is obviously a lot of internal discussions, and they have been going on since the beginning of the conflict, of how to basically lower the cost of trade, and they are being, they're increasing because there's not a lot of insurers and they're not willing to risk, given the war situation, to underwrite such risky shipments. I mean, we are obviously looking at ways internally. I can't talk details because they're quite complicated, but our Taxud DG, responsible for customs and taxation and others are working also closely with Ukrainians on seeing how that also could be a factor in lowering the cost of transport. I can't say more than this at the moment, but just to underscore that it is indeed a very important part of what we're discussing internally.
Thank you. Martin.
Yeah. Maybe two quick points. I mean, on one side, WFP is not only a humanitarian organization, it's also an organization that's trying to build food security on the ground, and in the context of climate, we are working with insurers in the framework of the African risk capacity in order to have broad climate insurance schemes that help that development progresses are not being undone. But when we are looking into specific climate risk, such as what has materialized, unfortunately, in Slovenia, functioning ecosystems are maybe the biggest insurance against climate risk. And if you look out of the window, you see steep hills, and despite the heavy rainfalls, they are not coming down because there is vegetation. There are trees that are anchoring. And there is a million examples how a functioning ecosystem can actually help buffer impacts, whether it comes to zones in cities where water can infiltrate in the soil because the soil is not sealed with concrete as it is in so many cities. So when we are looking into preventing risk, looking ahead, we need to factor in ecosystem services into that equation.
Thank you. I mean, the session is not just about obviously the return of hunger, but we ask ourselves the question, how can we build a more affordable, accessible and resilient food systems? And Deike, you briefly touched upon one very important word, private sector, and civil society. And I know this is something that you've argued for quite some time, the need to better balance and integrate the relationship between obviously governments, but the private sector and civil society. So how unfortunately Ms. Darosha cannot be with us, but President Lula was obviously attending the BRICS summit last week in Johannesburg, and he met with representatives from Angola, and he stressed the need for the Brazilian agribusiness to, get a greater interest in Angola and build more relationship. And so we see at a time when we say, okay, it's deglobalization. Well, on the contrary, when it comes to agriculture, it would seem that we have a kind of re-globalization, as the World Trade Organization would put it to. So how do you, as a diplomat, again, working on both crisis prevention, peace building and humanitarian assistance, what's the role or the space for the private sector?
Thank you so much for that question. Let me give you like 2 points on that. First of all, if you look at the funding situation, it is very clear that the current funding is, or the budgets are not sustainable. You have the 10 biggest donors accounting for more than 80% of humanitarian assistance worldwide. The largest 3, which is the United States, European Union, and Germany, account for more than 60%. So we need other donors. And we feel that there is also space for the private sector. Now, some of them are already engaged, but we need to see more engagement. On the other hand, we feel that, as you were saying, we also need more private business going into particularly fragile settings to help develop the economy, to create jobs for people, and to also bring innovation, particularly with regards also to agriculture, by the way, to bring innovation, to make it more effective, more efficient, more sustainable. By the way, in brackets, we are also supporting the Innovation Accelerator by WFP based in Munich, who are exactly looking at that, how can that be done, and then spread sort of the insights from there so that then private sector can also implement it. On the other hand, we are also now in the process of launching a new program which we call Financing for Peace and Investing for Peace. Together with the UN, we are creating a trust fund that wants to offer blended financing so that then private business can use those loans basically then to invest particularly in fragile contexts, as I say, to bring investment, to bring people into work, and to create a more stable environment so that then really people find a way for a better livelihood. And I think there we really need the private sector. We are also talking, of course, to development banks to join in, but really the private sector, I think, is key on so many levels. So those are but 2 examples of what we can do.
Maciej, perhaps you'd like to follow up on that, because I know it's a topic which is very close to what you've been pushing for quite some time now.
Yes, no, absolutely. One of the things, again, it's not a purely agricultural portfolio initiative, it is DG Development's initiative, but as we work in all sorts of nexuses, right? So yes, we have an initiative called the Global Gateway Initiative that wants to bring in around 300 billion euros in all sorts of investments with our partners, including Africa and other parts of the world, including private sector. Ourselves, as EU, we ourselves have actually funds that work with investment, VIB, for example, and others. So we bring in private funding already. With this particular focus that this panel has, the Global Gateway strategy, we already, in terms of sustainable food systems, we're trying to we've committed around 18 billion, if I'm not mistaken, 18 billion in our so-called Team Europe approach, including member states and private partners in grants, of which 7 billion has been disbursed already in 2022. So that money in our cooperation with Africa has already been working. There was a very good moment in July where Commissioner Wojciechowski was present at the so-called stock-taking moment for the global food systems in Rome, in FAO, where that was also discussed, the better involvement of private sector. So we put in the context of our global gateway, and I think the Africans, especially Africans, as we discussed with African Union, that particular initiative are on board, and we'll be rolling out projects, especially to promote local production. One thing, if I may, I don't know, maybe you will touch about it later, is that for my commissioner, I mean, because he neither deals with development strategies, he doesn't deal with humanitarian support, he deals with productivity and food security at home in Europe. But Europe has particular responsibility, obviously, for global food security. As Martin and others said, there is a big financing gap, and Europe tries to, obviously, with its budget of over 1.7 billion euros a year, fill in that commitment. And it was also said by a German friend who talked about how big of a donor EU is with others too. But what we're trying to do here is to ensure that what we have at home is not lost in terms of its prowess. So climate, as Martin said, but also the whole transformation of the food chain system along the Green Deal is also increasing certain costs. Obviously, in the long run, we must absolutely go that route, but we cannot at the same time forget that to get there, we need to have farmers along the way. So building productivity in Africa, building productivity at home, ensuring that small farmers, which are the majority of farmers around the world, get the proper value added for what they produce out of gate. Here we have to remember that, and this is a FAO statistics that my commissioner always mentions, is that 83% of farmers are small farmers with land area under 2 hectares. But imagine this, they produce over, and they operate 12% of the land, but they produce over a third of world's food. And without that attention to smallholders, including private sector attention to smallholders with public money mixed in, I don't think we can talk about food security in the long run. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Before we open up to the floor, do we already have some questions, perhaps? Oh, it's a very shy audience this morning. I guess you will warm up within the next minutes or so, I hope. But we have microphones. But I'd like to follow up on one point, and again, going back to perhaps Ukraine, before we go to land restoration, which is really something important, and I'd like to address it. We have heard now, 40 minutes into our discussion, that obviously food security is a human rights, to some extent a global public good. To what extent has the impact that this Black Sea Grain Initiative, or let's say Black Sea Grain issue, had on the most fragile countries who have been hit by the fact that they no longer receive the food? To what extent has this had an impact on the perception of the war in what we call the global South? Because we realize that now it's not just a European problem; it is a problem in Europe with a global reach. Is it something that you've covered in the work at the Black Sea Grain Initiative?
Thank you, Gregoire. I will start that I don't like the notion global south. I don't like the labeling. There are various countries that are suffering from human insecurity. There are various countries that are in the edge of poverty. We know the problems in Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan. So I wouldn't label them all in one basket. Probably those who've been following the initiative also know that through the initiative it was managed to be exported more than 30 million, 32 if to be exact, to 45 countries across 3 continents. And WFP transported almost 1 million metric tons of cereals into Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen. The government of Ukraine, you probably know, also has done the pledge with the financial support of its partners to export Ukrainian grain through the initiative Grain from Ukraine also to the countries that are suffering from acute malnutrition and access to food. As I've been saying in my open remarks, the market works the way that the prices are going down when there is enough food in the market. It's not about where the destination is. So what we are facing, if there is no access to the food, then it is another crisis, not only of affordability but also availability. And we need to remember that Ukraine and Russian Federation were both countries that were in top of the export of grain. And of course, Russian Federation attacking Ukraine affected the world markets. And as I said, the initiative was covering and sending the food, but it was not based on the destination. This is both humanitarian and commercial agreement. That's how it was designed. Otherwise, the markets won't work, and the markets are dependent on the predictability, on the sustainability. That's why every time when we see the time close to extension of the deal every 120 days, it was clear that the markets were reacting immediately. And the markets are reacting fast on the price going up, but not so fast on the prices going down. And that's by the time when the prices on the global market, even with futures going down, those who are in the most acute need of food already feeling it and suffering it. So our job is to give this predictability to the markets, to the buyers, to the insurances, to give the predictability of the availability of the food, so it will become more affordable.
But we have obviously the past year has seen favorable weather condition that has actually led to a larger than average harvest at almost, if I'm not mistaken, 70 million tons. The thing is that stocks are piling up and exports are still blocked. So you actually have availability. Can we get a microphone to the lady in the front? Can you introduce yourself just to...
It's already example, rice shortage in the world, you know. India no more export food, rice from in other countries because it is like a lack of, because climate change.
Then you offer me then they're all great. You offer me a transition to climate change.
It will be worse, yeah.
Thank you very much. Then the gentleman in the back, then. Questions are burgeoning, so can you please introduce yourself? And
my name is Janez Malačić and is from University of Ljubljana. I want to pose a question about demography because we have discussed much about climate change yesterday and today, and now about food, but I haven't heard much or even anything about demography, especially at the world stage and Africa, sub-Saharan Africa also. And we see that this relatively geographically limited crisis in Ukraine pose very big problem for food security. But we will have in maybe 30 years period, a bit more maybe, doubling of Africa's population. And if we look for last 100 years, the population of the world increased by 6 billion. And if I extend this period to about 130 years, in 1930, there were 2 billion people in the world. Now it's approximately about 8, and in 130 years, we will have 10 billion. This is 5 times the number of 1930. And for me, it is unacceptable that we simply don't speak. Maybe we have somewhere in the back all these figures, but I think it should be addressed
yes.
much more than we can see from.
We can see. Thank you very much for raising that issue. I think it's definitely an important question. Does anyone want to? Martin, perhaps, yes. Thank you again for your question, sir.
Yeah, maybe very briefly. I mean, first of all, even in a situation where we have 350 million people acutely hungry and more than 800 million people hungry, there would be enough food for 8 billion people. It's still a distribution problem. It is not that the planet would not feed 8 billion people. That's my first remark. The second remark is and you know, I very much have my environmentalist hat on, if you look at climate damages, those poorest are not contributing to the climate crisis. The entire African continent is less than 5% of the climate emissions. So here, demoscopic is not a problem. But of course, we see countries in which population growth is so fast that it's very difficult to feed. I'm thinking of Niger, where you have a population growth of around 3% a year, which is unbelievable. But then again, you know, if I'm looking back just to my own father, he was the youngest of 12 children, and that was normal not so long ago. How do you stop that? Well, very much has to do, obviously, with women's rights. And it starts with girls, it starts with education of girls. And one of the things, and I'm only 2 years with the World Food Program, one of the things that really stunned me was this direct relationship of school feeding programs with, you know, ending child marriage and starting later the reproductive cycle. Girls that receive school feeding stay longer in school, have a higher level of education, and end up being the mother of 2, maybe 3 children, and not 8 or 9 children. So this is, if you want to get population under control, the strongest measure you're having is empowering women, starting with the girls and making sure they have access to basically the 2 most basic things. One is education, the second one is land tenure.
Thank you, Martin. Deike, do you want to?
Well, I can echo what Martin said, but and I'm glad that he made the pitch for women's rights. But in terms of education, we also need to educate the men. so I think it goes both ways.
On the record, on the record.
But yes, I mean, it's true that there is enough food. It's a question of distribution, but it is also now, given climate change, as you were saying, it is also now really an issue of finding the right crops, the right, you know, food that we grow. That's what I meant when we were talking about sustainable, resilient crops. We really need to invest much more into that. Water is a huge issue in so many countries these days, be it too much or too little. So we also need to look into this. And I wanted to thank Maryna also for highlighting again how interconnected everything is. I think you very rightly pointed to the question of demography. But there are all these factors, be it the question of peace, be it the question of education, be it climate change. It's all interconnected, and we shouldn't shy away from trying to tackle all these problems at the same time. It's huge, but I think we should try to be positive and also look at the positive results that we achieve in certain contexts already. And simply, we do not have an option to shy away from these issues, but we need to understand better how the linkages function and then work jointly on the different aspects.
And the holistic approach. Yes, and I see a comment, no, in Brussels, no, or is it an illusion?
Yes, I did raise my hand. There's a lot of echo suddenly, I don't know why, on the demography part, from our perspective as agriculture, we look a lot at the demographic transition among the farmers themselves. So while the global trends, demographic trends are one thing, and indeed they vary a lot. I mean, you have a huge increases in Africa, but then you have kind of a secular declines in more urbanized regions of the world. So it's a complicated picture. But when it comes to farming, and I talked about sustainability long term of our farmer and those who are feeding the world, in a sense, those who are trying to support the distribution, getting to where the food is needed. So the let's say our exporting countries like European countries, US, etc. We need to really address the demographic decline among the farmers. The average age in Europe is 55. Over a third of farmers in Europe are over 65 years of age. There's a problem with replacement, basically generational replacement. Very few kids, children of farmers want to continue living on farm. We've lost 3 million farms in the past decade, mostly through consolidation. But if we look at the statistics I gave you about the importance of small and medium-sized farmers, I don't think we can actually I don't think we can sustain ourselves long-term just with more and more consolidation, having ginormous holdings that will somehow become more productive. This is not an equation. Bigger doesn't necessarily mean more productive or more efficient. So from our perspective, again, from a commercial perspective, the demographics is a lot about aging of the farmers, just to give a bit of a different perspective for those who actually grow the food.
Thank you very much. And I guess that it also touches upon the need to double down on investment in technologies and automation. Maryna.
Yeah, I'll just like to echo what was said by the panelists. So the World Bank issued the report that the population of African continent will be the youngest population globally. By 2030, it will be 1/5 of the world population. But I would like also to bring your attention that they will also have the tremendous human capital, and they're also the consumers. And because they will be the youngest population, we need to ensure that they will be executing their resources and making sustainable for themselves. Let's not count on the dependencies. And it's exactly what was said about education. It's about access to the resources. It's about empowerment, rather than to continue make the African continent dependent. Already recognize that they will be the youngest, and they should be more sustainable into providing for themselves. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess Mr. Saito, am I correct? Do I recognize you? Yes, from Japan, please.
Hi, my name is Kohei Saito. I'm from Japan. I have a question about there is enough food. I understand currently there is enough food. It's a distribution problem. But at the same time, this food production itself is based on the agribusiness, and they're main driver of the climate crisis. And the global food system itself is one of the largest emission of carbon dioxide. So when we really try to make all the food production more sustainable, it means we need more organic food and we need more local production. So these importing crops everywhere, exporting, that kind of the global market doesn't work anymore because it itself drives the climate crisis, and the climate crisis will have the damage on agriculture and so on. So I'm not that optimistic. It's not just simply about distribution problem, it's also production problem. And in that sense, maybe we should also talk about reducing our meat consumptions and other more radical measures. We need also to change. And I want to hear your opinion about that kind of issues.
Thank you very much. I guess this is a sneak into the session we'll have later today on the future of values in capitalism, but please, Martin.
Well, thank you for the question. And I spent some years of my life advocating to think about food as a system, and that's exactly what you do. Because if we look at our current food systems, we afford ourselves to inefficiencies which are very difficult to justify. We have about 36% of food waste in rich countries. We get about the same number of post-harvest losses in poor countries, which are massive inefficiencies. In the European Union, we have about 60% of the grain that's being eaten by animals, not by human beings. And that is also an inefficiency. And then we are basically having a blind spot in what our agricultural production does in terms of climate footprint, and the climate footprint of food systems is enormous, and what it does in terms of depletion of water resources and destruction of biodiversity. Deike just made the point about the need to diversify our food system, and that is something I feel is very strongly a pressure point. 60% of our calories today come from 3 crops, from rice, from corn, and from wheat. And that dependency is staggering. we have an industrialized, normatized food system where in many places of the world, going back to traditional crops, think millet in Western Africa, think lentils in India, would make not only environmental sense, but also nutritional sense, because millet is more healthy than imported wheat coming from the other side of the globe. Lentils have all the micronutrients that you don't find, and they need less water. So we need to think in a systemic issue, and also be mindful that in agrobusiness, this global food situation is often used as an argument to produce more no matter what. And I think that's not right, because if you think about sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and you just mentioned how small the plots are of smallholder farmers, and yet they are providing 80% of the food Africans actually eat, not export, but eat. So if we look closer into the systemic issue, there is no way around supporting smallholder farmers, focusing on them, which is demanding, because you're dealing with very, very small units, and organizing smallholder farmers, making them, for example, also access the global carbon trading so they get paid for the ecosystem services they provide, could be a possibility to have a more stable, more resilient, more ecosystem friendly, and not least, more just and fair food system.
Maciej, do you want to bounce back on that or not necessary? I can't. I see your hand, but I don't know whether.
Well, I have a lot of echo. I don't know. Suddenly, there's just so much echo. I can barely understand what everybody's
our great technicians. So
talking
there's
about.
echo
Maybe
in Brussels.
it started when the questions opened to the audience, but I just wanted to ad-lib to what Martin said, and I absolutely agree with him about the diversification of not only biodiversity, diversification of agriculture, but also ensuring that small, big, and medium ones are present in the market. One of the statistics about the census that I mentioned before that also struck my commissioner, myself, is the mixed farms. We used to have a lot of mixed farms in Europe, over 3 million farms. 10 years later, we only have a bit less, 1.8 million ones. What does that mean? That means that livestock, which is obviously the culprit, for example, for emissions, the livestock farms, the mixed lives, well, basically what's happening is becoming more monocropic. So we have monocrops and maybe a big livestock farms on separately, but not as a mixed farm. The problem there is that in the mixed environment, we can actually promote circularity. We can promote reducing dependence on fertilizers and things like that because of manure being present in the farm, etc. So there's a circularity that we need. So the point about supporting smallholder is also supporting mixed farms, where actually you're going to get some livestock because we still need animal protein, but it will be supporting the ecosystem circular approach that the small and medium-sized farms promote. And that again is in decline. So there is, we need to ensure also that in the developing world, we don't go the same route that we did in Europe. So that's our global responsibility.
Thank you very much. We have a lady in the back. I apologize, you've had your hand raised for hours, and now
No problem. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jana. I come from Slovenian civil society, Caritas Slovenia. I would like to add what you already said, and from our experience in the field in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's not just enough to support small farmers, especially women, but also to help especially young generation in Africa, which we heard already, half of Africa is young, to get some businesses out of the farms, also farmers. So there's enough food on the world, but there's not enough money to buy it. We implement, for example, now one project supported by Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs in Rwanda, and we are doing all together, helping small farmers to improve their agricultural practices. In the same time, we are giving them chances to start their small business. And after 3 years, we see on the field big change in these poor, vulnerable families. So they can survive their families, they have enough food, their children go to school, they have the means for the health, and so on. And I think that Europe and all the developed world must invest in the environmental friendly industry, in African countries to give to the younger generation more work and also know-how transfer. What we also see through our private sectors, which we are already involving in these ministry projects, they can really transfer a lot of know-how also to start a business and so on. I think this is still a big field what we can do, and of course, even there is a lot of distresses also right now because of the floods in Slovenia, but also elsewhere, also in the developed world. We can't forget on the global south, we need to fulfill our obligation regarding ODA and support these countries much more than ever, because the hunger in Africa is really growing, what we also hear from our local partner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Deike, do you want to bounce back on that, or we'll take a last question? Yeah? Then there's a lady in the front row over there, if someone can...
Yeah, thank you. My name is Audrey Namdiera-Walsh with the Global Diplomacy Lab, and actually he touched upon my question, because I was thinking, as we're talking about food security, we also cannot ignore nutrition security, which is a huge thing, which also has links also to environmental practices. You know, the overfishing that we see. So what we concentrate on in terms of what's on our table does have an impact in terms of our own nutrition, but also the security of, you know, the environment, you know, the sea piracy that we see, but also what actually goes onto our table. So as you said, there were many intersecting things that we talk about, you know, the security, so the war about, you know, who has fishing rights, you know, in certain parts. That is also, you know, something that we look about when we talk about the distribution, but it's also, at the end of the day, what does that have an effect on the supply chain, but also then the type of food that ends up on our plates. So thank you just for considering that as well.
Thank you very much. It was a half question or just a comment? It was more of a comment. Well, thank you very much. Yes, I guess so. We have 1 and 2. So yes, please, and the third one. So we are almost on time, so if you can be as short as you possibly can.
Very short. Hello,
my
name is Vivian Valencia. I'm a professor in Canada. I had a question following up on investment and the private sector. I've seen an increasing interest from impact investment funds in funding regenerative agriculture, biodiversity, food systems. So a lot of interest from wealthy families, etc., investors to support initiatives around the globe who may shift food systems, yet sometimes they don't have the technical expertise or the knowledge. I've been approached twice in the past few months to provide that type of technical expertise, so I've been very surprised with this increasing interest in funding and investing. So I just wanted to know what's your take on it, and how can we bring this sort of like increasing interest from the private sector to invest, and how can we best guide them so that they can put their money to good use and not be misled, or, you know, because they lack that expertise sometimes. So yeah, just your comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are the 2 remaining questions related to that or not? Yes, so the gentleman in the middle, and perhaps we can have a joint answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm Edwin Skrt. I'm heading the Directorate for Development Cooperation and Humanitarian Aid at the Slovenian Foreign and European Ministry. So the so-called food crisis is not something particularly new, but after the prices of the food on global markets skyrocketed after the Russian invasion on Ukraine, I have to say that I'm very proud that my government decided to increase the funding for the food crisis sixfold from 2021 to 2022, and I'm particularly proud that we kept the pace also in 2023, and I hope we will continue with this also in the future. And I'm also very happy that we have been strengthening the collaboration with the World Food Program in recent years. So you spoke about the involvement of the private sector, which is also needed to address the food crisis. And we know at the same time that the gap between the needs and the funding capacities is wide, and it's going to be even wider, and we don't have even to pretend that we will be ever able to fill that gap. And even if the development banks will be able to reform and be more involved in helping us to address the crisis, I still think we will need a lot of the involvement of the private sector. But if the private sector wants to be involved, there should be profit. At the same time, there is half of the population that needs assistance in food deliveries. They live in conditions the donor governments don't want to be involved with those governments that are in the areas where these people live. So how to bring the private sector into the countries where there are authoritarian regimes and where there are not even guarantees for the international humanitarian law to be observed.
Thank you very much. And if, in a very short answer, if you can, so that we can address the two questions and then conclude our panel. Deike, or?
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. Like on your question, I on the other hand get approached a lot by be it UN trust funds and also a lot of implementing bodies searching for money. So I think to interlink those those interested to donate or to invest, which I feel is in the long run the much better version of spending the money, to really invest into a sustainable solution. That is an issue that we need to look into much better. But like as I was referring to this Investing for Peace fund that we are creating now, we are doing this with the UN Capital Development Fund. So do spread the word. But I'm sure that also WFP is very happy to reach out to you and see how to interlink with private business. I think there's a huge scope for work. And what you are saying, I mean, you are extremely right in questioning, you know, the particular context where this can happen, where really private sector can get engaged. And yes, they want to make money. But I mean, some are still doing it for altruistic reasons, which is great. But then, of course, a lot of them want to make money. But this is again also behind that scheme that I was describing with the Financing for Peace agenda, exactly to allow them to invest and make money in those areas. Maybe not as much as in other contexts, but if they want to get engaged for a good cause, I think we can offer something. But we need to broaden this and also make them aware that what we want is what we call the peace positive investment. Like you do see a lot of investment in also fragile contexts, but it sometimes does not help sort of to conquer the fragility, but we need to find ways of changing that so that they really contribute to a better, more peaceful, stable environment, which then also helps us in fighting hunger.
Thank you, Deike. I'm told we only have 5 minutes, and that includes the concluding of the panel. So I ask you, sir, to ask a question is in what, 30 seconds? Is that feasible? Yeah. With a question mark at the end, ideally. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience.
My name is Peo Bosnic. I'm from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and given that Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe, and given the current invasion of it, is there a potential for the major of food production to be redirected to other rural areas in Europe, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, or Serbia? And can we expect lower food prices in the next couple of years?
You're my champion. 25 seconds with a question mark. Thank you so much. Maciej, there's something on the screen, so Maciej looks beheaded, but I guess he's still. Are you still with us? Yeah, you're back. Your head is back on your body. So, do you want to answer that question?
Well, whether we can try. Well, again, the echo is a little bit making it a bit more difficult for me to hear everything properly. But if I understood the question, whether we can move the center of production from Ukraine or to others. I mean, look, these are private choices of farmers, and they depend also on the specificities of soils, etc. Ukraine boasts amazing high categories of soil that are unprecedented. It's very difficult to recreate those kind of conditions everywhere in the world. So there's some natural advantages that Ukraine has. I'm not sure what kind of land Bosnia and Herzegovina has, for example, but we do, as EU, pay a lot of attention to soil health, and we didn't talk much about it. We do invest a lot in soil research and increasing organic matter in soil. We have a lot of R&D in soil. We have a soil monitoring law recently passed that requires monitoring the quality of soils. So we do want to, as EU, to increase the efficiency and the health of farming soil everywhere in Europe so that we are more productive. That's, I guess, how I would respond to this question. In terms of prices, I mean, prices are a function of, again, the war has really, brought this out. We had the dam break in Ukraine also put a lot of pressure on prices when it comes to vegetables and fruit, etc. I think FAO is monitoring these, and they think that again, we cannot, barring any geopolitical worsening geopolitical circumstances, and hoping that the Black Sea ports will finally open up, we'll see an improvement in lowering the prices.
Thank you very much. We only have 3 minutes, and I would like Maryna to answer that important question. So I'm still running short of positivity here. The prospect is still very gloomy. So I'd like to ask all our panelists, provided we're back here next year, same room, same panel, almost same topic, what would be a positive development likely to come up? And I'll start with you, Maryna.
Thank you. I will be brief. At first, I'd like to comment on the previous question. First, I'm in the work of mediation, and in order to look into investments in some particular countries, you need to look exclusively in one particular country and look into the interest that business can get, and actually show them the positive scenarios. You need to start framing with the win-win. You cannot say we need you without what you get into. So I'm sure that it is possible. There are scenarios that could be looked into. It's just about the political will to start looking into it. And it's about countries that are right now not maybe in the most, let's say, positive investment. I know that many businesses are also reluctant to invest in Ukraine, particularly of the risks. So it is about showing what will be the benefits and what will be the positive scenarios and what would be the insurances. Getting back to your question, first of all, due to the war, lots of production have moved to other countries. It is already the reality. Due to the constant attacks by Russian Federation on Ukraine, on infrastructure, you've seen the blackouts. Ukraine was exporting just the raw agri products. We know that, like for example, Turkey was doing then the flour, the meal, and was exporting it further. The same was going from the sunflower seeds, sunflower meal, so it does exist. I'm not sure about the potential of Bosnia and Herzegovina due to your soil and climate, and it's totally a different story if to look on a country basis. Being positive at the end.
In 10 seconds.
I hope that next year we will meet and the war on Ukraine will be over and we wouldn't have to discuss how to unblock the ports, but this is my really positive wishful thinking. In case if it's not happening, let's continue, stand united, let's work on diversification, and let's look into how to unblock the ports and how to maintain the food flowing.
Thank you very much, Maryna. Deike?
Well, in a way, the same wish here. Next year we meet, the war in Ukraine is over, but also a lot of the conflicts, for instance, on the African continent, are less, contentious and less visible, so we have achieved something there as well. That would lead to less refugees, less IDPs, less people losing their homes, losing their livelihoods, and then also leading to more stability and more food security, less people going hungry. So I think to look at the stabilization of conflicts, the solution of conflicts worldwide would be my positive, maybe wishful, but still thinking.
Thank you. And Martin, Maciej, you have 10 seconds each, because I'm being threatened by the organizers in the back. You can't see it, but my head is on the line.
Okay, I will be super fast. If you look at the global crisis, 60% of global land degraded, climate crisis, there is 1 billion people in Africa and other places who are the poorest people on this planet, who are young. We need to look differently at them, not as recipients, as aids, but as an army of people who can help us getting out of this quagmire if we manage to support them and see them as stewards of our collective life support system.
So younger generation, thank you so much. And the last word to Brussels, to you, Maciej.
Okay, 10 seconds. One thing that was not mentioned, and I hope it will improve next year, is the multilateral environment, the work at the WTO. We need to ensure that we have a working global, open and fair trading system in food that lowers prices for all. And also, I hope that we're going to see a bit more movement on boosting local production everywhere that food is needed through private and other types of actions and investments. So, and the war, absolutely. We hope it's over by then.
Thank you so much to everyone here. So shall we meet each other next year? Hopefully,
hope to be able to be present physically.
And you're being present with us. Thank you so much, Maciej in Brussels. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the online audience. I think the panel deserves a big hand, and I'll see you around today.
Thank you.